6 World Heavyweight Championships, over 6,000 career matches, 936 consecutive victories, a combined title reign spanning more than 10 years, 3 months, and 9 days, 3,749 days as world champion, a record that still stands and probably never will be broken. Over 200 broken bones, 16 million miles traveled, and a career that stretched across 7 different decades, from 1932 to 1990, from the Great Depression to the fall of the Berlin Wall, from radio broadcasts to satellite television. Thesz did not just dominate professional wrestling. He was professional wrestling. At 6 feet 2 and 225 pounds, Thesz was not the biggest man in any room. He was not the flashiest, the loudest, or the most charismatic showman of his era. What he was, quite simply, was the most dangerous human being who ever stepped between the ropes. A legitimate catch wrestler, a trained hooker who could snap bones and dislocate joints with the casual precision of a surgeon, Thesz was the man promoters trusted when they needed absolute certainty that the planned outcome would happen, because if anyone tried to double-cross the script, Thesz would make them regret it in ways that required medical attention. He invented the powerbomb. He invented the STF. He pioneered what the world would come to call the German suplex. He created the Thesz press, the same move Stone Cold Steve Austin would use half a century later to electrify arenas around the globe. Every single night in professional wrestling, somewhere on the planet, a move Thesz created is being performed. He became the youngest world heavyweight champion in history at 21 years old. And he was still competing at 74. Nobody in the history of combat sports has sustained excellence across that kind of timeline. Nobody. So how good was Thesz actually? And does the man who unified the World Championship, helped create Japanese wrestling, and wrestled across 7 decades deserve to be called the greatest professional wrestler who ever lived? The story begins not in America, but in Hungary. Thesz's father, Martin Thesz, was a middleweight Greco-Roman wrestling champion in his native country before emigrating to the United States with his wife, Catherine, a woman of German descent. The family settled briefly in the small community of Banat, Michigan, where Aloysius Martin Thesz, the boy who would reshape an entire industry, was born on April 24, 1916. The Thesz household ran on immigrant grit and working-class discipline. Martin opened a shoe repair shop, and the family eventually relocated to St. Louis, Missouri, a city that would become synonymous with Lou's legend. German was the language spoken at home. Young Lou did not learn English until kindergarten. Every Saturday until he was 8, he attended German school. He grew up mending soles and hammering heels in his father's shop, absorbing the relentless work ethic that would define his career. But Martin Thesz gave his son something far more valuable than a cobbler's trade. Starting when Lou was 8 years old, his father subjected him to a rigorous, sometimes brutal education in Greco-Roman wrestling. This was not recreation. This was foundational combat training delivered by a man who understood leverage, balance, and the mechanics of controlling another human body. Those lessons in the back of a shoe repair shop in Depression-era St. Louis were building the framework for a dynasty. By his early teens, Lou had transitioned to folk-style and freestyle wrestling at Cleveland High School, dominating citywide intramural competitions in the 160-pound division. He was fast. He was technically precise, and he had a predatory instinct that no amount of coaching can teach: an ability to feel where an opponent's weight was shifting before the opponent knew it himself. Lou dropped out of school at 14 to help support the family, but he never stopped wrestling. He competed in regional amateur tournaments, racking up titles and drawing the attention of local promoters who recognized that this quiet, intense teenager with the old world discipline was something special. Tom Pax, a St. Louis wrestling promoter, saw Thesz wrestle and knew immediately: this kid was not a prospect, he was a weapon. What happened next would have been impossible without 3 men who shaped Thesz into perhaps the most technically complete wrestler in history. The first was George Tragos, a former Greek Olympic wrestler who had settled in St. Louis and became one of the most respected catch wrestling coaches in the country. Tragos drilled into the teenage Thesz a philosophy that would stay with him for life: Legitimacy above everything. Every hold had to work. Every takedown had to be real. If you could not actually control a man on the mat, you had no business pretending you could. Tragos gave Thesz the foundation, the amateur wrestling bedrock that separated him from the theatrical performers who were already beginning to flood the business. The second mentor was Ad Santel, a legendary shooter from the old school who further refined Thesz's grappling. But the most consequential relationship of Lou's life was with the third man, Ed Strangler Lewis, the biggest wrestling star of the 1920s and a six-time world heavyweight champion. Lewis saw the 16-year-old Thesz and made a pronouncement that reads like prophecy in hindsight. He described the young man as lithe as a panther and exceptionally fast, adding that he moves with the speed of a lightweight. Lewis did not just admire the kid, he adopted him as a protege and taught him the dark art of hooking, the ability to apply excruciating submission holds that could dislocate joints, tear ligaments, and incapacitate an opponent who refused to cooperate. In the carnival-rooted world of professional wrestling, where double crosses and shoot attempts were constant threats, a hooker was the most feared figure in any locker room. Lewis made Thesz into the most dangerous hooker of his generation. Lou Thesz made his professional wrestling debut in 1932. He was 16 years old. He had no flashy gimmick, no elaborate costume, no theatrical persona. He wore plain wrestling trunks, wrestling shoes, and a warm-up robe. He looked like what he was, a wrestler, and by the mid-1930s, the St. Louis territory already knew it had something extraordinary on its hands. The shoe repairman's son from Banat, Michigan, was not just winning matches. He was dismantling opponents with a clinical efficiency that made veteran wrestlers nervous. The question was no longer whether Lou Thesz would become champion. The question was how long anyone could possibly keep the belt away from him. On December 29, 1937, Lou Thesz defeated Everett Marshall for the National Wrestling Association World Heavyweight Championship. He was 21 years old. To this day, no one has ever won a recognized World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship at a younger age. Let that settle for a moment. In an era when professional wrestling was still populated by hardened men who had come up through carnivals, coal mines, and legitimate amateur circuits, men who would sooner break your arm than lose a fall, a 21-year-old kid walked into their world and took the crown. He lost the title 6 weeks later to Steve Crusher Casey in Boston. The business worked differently then. Titles changed hands strategically based on territory economics, and a young champion needed seasoning before a long run. But the message had been sent. Thesz recaptured the championship in 1939, again defeating Marshall, and the trajectory was unmistakable. This was not a flash-in-the-pan attraction. This was a generational talent with the amateur credentials to back up any challenge and the hooking ability to neutralize any threat. Then the world intervened. In 1944, Thesz enlisted in the United States Army, serving through the end of World War II until 1946. 2 prime years of his career gone. 2 years when he should have been cementing his dominance, spent in military service while the wrestling landscape shifted without him. Other men would have returned diminished, disconnected, irrelevant. Thesz came back hungrier. In 1948, he defeated Bill Longson for the National Wrestling Association's World Heavyweight title in Indianapolis, and this time, the championship reign would not be measured in weeks. That same year, the National Wrestling Alliance was formally established, a coalition of regional promoters who agreed to recognize a single world heavyweight champion who would travel between territories, defending the belt and drawing money in every city. The plan was to hold a unification match between Thesz and the NWA's first designated champion, Orville Brown. Weeks before the bout, Brown was involved in a devastating automobile accident that ended his career. The NWA awarded the title to their #1 contender. Lou Thesz was now the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, and the most important era in wrestling championship history was about to begin. But Thesz was not satisfied with one belt and one claim. The wrestling world in the late 1940s and early 1950s was fractured. Multiple promoters recognized different men as world champion. Thesz looked at the chaos and decided, with the same cold logic he applied on the mat, that there should be only one undisputed champion, him. What followed was arguably the most ambitious title unification campaign in professional wrestling history. Thesz was not content to sit in one territory and defend a belt that some promoters refused to recognize. He went hunting. In 1950, He defeated Gorgeous George to unify the Boston AWA World Championship with his existing NWA title. In 1952, he traveled to Los Angeles and defeated Baron Michel Leon for the LA Olympic Auditorium World Heavyweight Championship in a 2-out-of-3 falls match that drew massive attention. And with that victory, Thesz accomplished what no wrestler before him had done. He unified 4 separate world championship lineages into a single, undisputed title. The original World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship, the belt that traced its lineage back to 1905, through legends like George Hackenschmidt, Frank Gotch, and Ed Strangler Lewis, was now part of the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, and Lou Thesz was the man who held it all together. The NWA chose Thesz for this role deliberately. They needed a champion who could be trusted. Absolutely a man whose legitimate wrestling ability ensured that no rogue competitor could deviate from the planned finishes. In the parlance of the business, Thesz was insurance. If a challenger decided to go into business for himself and shoot on the champion, Thesz had the skills to stretch him, hurt him, and make him submit for real. That was not a theoretical concern. It happened. And every single time it happened, Lou Thesz handled it. The evolution was not just about titles, it was about the way Thesz carried himself as champion. He traveled relentlessly, sometimes wrestling 200 to 250 times a year, often driving all night from one city to the next. He demanded that his matches maintain an aura of athletic legitimacy. He insisted that the NWA champion should never appear on cards featuring circus-style gimmicks. He negotiated his own pay with surgical precision, demanding cash payments and written gate statements from promoters to ensure he received his fair percentage. He was, in every sense, a professional, a man who treated the World Championship as a legitimate sporting title and defended it with corresponding seriousness. From 1948 to 1955, Lou Thesz won 936 consecutive matches, nearly 1,000 victories without a single defeat. For 7 years, no man on the planet could beat him. The numbers sound impossible, because they almost are. During this stretch, Thesz was not just the best wrestler alive. He was so far beyond the competition that the word dominance feels inadequate. He was the standard by which every other wrestler in every territory was measured, and none of them measured up. The first NWA World Heavyweight Championship reign, the Monster Reign, lasted from November 1949 to March 1956, 2,300 days, 6 years, 3 months, and 16 days, with the most important belt in professional wrestling strapped around his waist. No NWA champion before or since has held the title for that long in a single reign. To put the number in perspective, Ric Flair's entire combined championship time across 8 reigns totals 3,116 days. Thesz nearly matched that in one single run. During those years, Thesz was the traveling champion, the man who showed up in your territory, defended the belt against your top challenger, and left with the gold. Every city, every crowd, every opponent was different, and Thesz had to adapt every night. He wrestled scientific grapplers, brawlers, strongmen, and showmen. He wrestled in sold-out arenas and half-empty gymnasiums. He wrestled in the United States, Canada, and eventually on the other side of the world. The title unification matches were the crown jewels of this period. The bout against Baron Michel Leon in Los Angeles in 1952 was a spectacle. Leon was the biggest star on the West Coast, a legitimate draw who filled the Olympic Auditorium and held a version of the world title that his promotion's fans considered the real championship. Thesz walked into hostile territory, worked the 2-out-of-3 falls match, and walked out with Leone's belt absorbed into the NWA lineage. It was not just a win, it was a statement. There is only one world champion, and you are looking at him. But even the greatest reign must end, and Thesz's first NWA run concluded in March of 1956, when Whipper Billy Watson defeated him by countout in Toronto. The loss was controversial. Many NWA members disputed whether a countout should constitute a title change, but Watson's victory stood. Thesz recaptured the championship later that year in street tennis. Louis, beginning a second reign that lasted 370 days before he lost to Dick Hutton. His third and most historically consequential reign came in 1963, and it was born from the most personal rivalry of his career. Buddy Rogers was everything Lou Thesz despised in a professional wrestler. Flamboyant, arrogant, theatrical nature boy Rogers was the prototype for every flashy heel who would follow him, from Ric Flair to every bleach-blonde villain who ever strutted into an arena. Rogers had become NWA World Heavyweight Champion in June of 1961 by defeating Pat O'Connor in a match that drew $148,000 in ticket sales. He was undeniably a draw. He was undeniably a star, and Lou Thesz absolutely could not stand him. The animosity was not an act. Thesz viewed Rogers as a symbol of everything that was going wrong with wrestling, the triumph of showmanship over substance, of character over competence. Rogers, for his part, understood that Thesz was dangerous in ways that went far beyond the scripted world. The NWA eventually decided that the title needed to come back to a legitimate wrestler, and they called Thesz out of semi-retirement for the job. On January 24, 1963, in Toronto, Canada, Lou Thesz and Buddy Rogers met for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. The atmosphere crackled with real tension. Rogers, by several accounts, had serious reservations about dropping the title to Thesz. Whether those reservations came from ego, business disagreements, or genuine fear of what Thesz might do if the match went off script, is a matter of historical debate. What is not debatable is the outcome. Thesz won the match in a single fall, a point of controversy that would reshape professional wrestling forever. Vincent J. McMahon, the Northeast promoter who had invested heavily in Rogers as his top draw, refused to recognize the title change. McMahon argued that the NWA title could only change hands in a 2 out of 3 falls match, and declared the result invalid. Within months, McMahon withdrew from the National Wrestling Alliance entirely and formed the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, naming Rogers as its inaugural champion. That company would eventually become the WWE. The biggest wrestling promotion in the history of the planet exists, in a very real sense, because Lou Thesz defeated Buddy Rogers. But the consequences went even further than the birth of the WWF. Thesz's matches in Japan during the late 1950s had already planted seeds that would grow into an entire national obsession. When he traveled to Japan in 1957 as NWA champion, he faced Rikidozan, a former sumo wrestler who was building professional wrestling from the ground up in the land of the rising Sunday. Their matches at Korakuen Stadium in Tokyo were broadcast on national television and became among the 10 highest-rated television airings in Japanese history. Thesz and Rikidozan wrestled to dramatic 60-minute draws, and the Japanese public was transfixed. Professional wrestling exploded in Japan, and the NWA created the International Heavyweight Championship specifically for Thesz to defend in the Japanese market a title that would eventually become part of All Japan Pro Wrestling's prestigious Triple Crown Championship. Without Lou Thesz, there is no Japanese professional wrestling as we know it, no New Japan, no All Japan, no Puroresu tradition. He did not merely participate in the globalization of wrestling, he authored it. His third NWA reign lasted over a year before he dropped the title to Gene Kiniski in January of 1966. By then, Thesz was nearly 50 years old and had been a main event attraction for 3 decades. Most men would have walked away. Thesz did not know how. For all the victories, all the championships, all the miles and the broken bones, there was a cost to living the life Lou Thesz lived. He was married 3 times. The road consumed everything: relationships, health, normalcy. He drove through the night between cities so often that his body became a roadmap of accumulated damage. Over 200 fractures across a career, artificial hips, the physical toll of 6 decades of controlled violence. But the deepest wound was the loneliness that came with being the traveling champion in an era before cell phones, before the internet, before anything that might have kept a man connected to the people he loved while he crisscrossed a continent. Thesz wrote about it with characteristic understatement in his autobiography, Hooker. He did not dwell on the pain. He was not built for self-pity. But between the lines, the isolation is unmistakable. The hotels, the empty highways, the constant cycle of new cities and new opponents, and the same belt around his waist. The thing that sustained him was an almost religious devotion to the craft. Thesz genuinely believed that professional wrestling, at its core, was a legitimate athletic endeavor, and that the men who performed it had a duty to maintain that standard. He watched the business change around him, the rise of theatrical gimmicks, the decline of mat wrestling, the slow erosion of everything he had spent his life building, and it wounded him more deeply than any suplex ever could. He spoke about Hulk Hogan with undisguised contempt, calling him an absolutely horrible performer, notorious for his total ignorance of wrestling. While acknowledging his charisma, he saw the future of the business, and he hated it. Yet even in bitterness, there was purpose. Thesz channeled his passion into training the next generation, passing down the hooking techniques he had learned from Lewis and Tragos to students who would carry the lineage forward. Among them was Masahiro Chono, a young Japanese wrestler who would become one of New Japan Pro Wrestling's biggest stars. The old champion poured everything he knew into these students, ensuring that even as the spectacle swallowed the sport, someone somewhere would remember what wrestling was supposed to be. Most careers end with a slow fade. Thesz's simply refused to end at all. Through the 1970s, he continued wrestling on a part-time basis, still capable of convincing performances well into his 50s and 60s. In 1978, at the age of 62, he traveled to Mexico and won the inaugural Universal Wrestling Association World Heavyweight Championship. 62 years old and winning a world title. The human body is not designed for that. Thesz's body apparently did not get the memo. He held the UWA title for roughly a year before dropping it to El Canik. And in 1979, after a match with Luke Graham, he officially retired. The word officially deserves emphasis because Thesz and retirement had an adversarial relationship. On December 26, 1990, in Hamamatsu, Japan, 74-year-old Thesz stepped into a ring one final time. His opponent was his protege, Masahiro Chono. The man who had first competed professionally when Franklin Roosevelt was president was now wrestling in the era of George H.W. Bush, 7 decades. It is a span so absurd that it almost sounds fabricated, but every moment of it was real. During the match, Thesz's artificial hip gave way. It simply could not hold the combined weight of 2 men in combat any longer. Chono won. Thesz walked away for the last time, angry with himself for pushing beyond what his body could sustain, but characteristically philosophical about it. He would later say he was old enough to know better, but he did it anyway. After retiring from active competition, Thesz remained embedded in the wrestling world. He became president of the Cauliflower Alley Club in 1992, serving until 2000. He worked as a trainer, a referee for important matches in Japan, and a vocal critic of the direction the business had taken. He published Hooker in 2001, a candid autobiography that served as both memoir and manifesto, a declaration of what wrestling had been and what it should have remained. On April 9, 2002, Thesz underwent triple bypass surgery for an aortic valve replacement. Complications arose. On April 28, 4 days after his 86th birthday, Thesz died in Orlando, Florida. The sport he had given 60 years of his life to had lost its most authentic champion. Picture a 16-year-old kid in 1932, the son of a Hungarian shoemaker, stepping into a professional wrestling ring for the first time in Depression-era St. Louis. He has no gimmick. He has no character. He has calloused hands from fixing shoes and a body trained in Greco-Roman wrestling by a father who was a champion in the old country. Now picture that same man, 58 years later, climbing through the ropes in Japan at 74 years old. Still competing, still commanding respect, still dangerous. The distance between those two images is the career of Thesz, and there is nothing else in the history of professional wrestling, or perhaps in the history of sport itself, that compares to it. He held the NWA World Heavyweight Championship for a combined 10 years, 3 months, and 9 days. Ric Flair, the next closest, accumulated his combined total across 8 separate reigns. Thesz did it in 3. Harley Race, another all-time legend, managed 1,801 days across 8 reigns, less than half of Thesz's total. The gap between Thesz and the rest of the NWA championship lineage is not a gap, it is a canyon. But the numbers, staggering as they are, do not capture what made Thesz singular. He was the last universally accepted world champion, the last man who could walk into any territory on the planet and be recognized as the legitimate title holder by every promoter, every wrestler, and every fan. He unified fractured championship lineages through sheer will and ability. He traveled the globe when travel meant grueling drives and propeller planes, not chartered jets. He helped create professional wrestling in Japan, inadvertently birthed the company that would become WWE, and invented moves that are still performed every single night in arenas around the world. The Thesz press, the STF, the powerbomb, the German suplex in its earliest form. These are not obscure techniques, these are foundational elements of professional wrestling's vocabulary, created by one man. His consistency defies comprehension. For roughly 25 years, from the late 1930s to the early 1960s, Thesz was never far from the World Championship. A quarter of a century at the summit. Only a handful of athletes in any sport can claim a comparable window of dominance. Perhaps Gordie Howe in hockey, perhaps Nolan Ryan in baseball, and even those comparisons feel strained. The conversation about the greatest professional wrestler of all time inevitably expands to include several names, and each of them deserves genuine respect. Ric Flair carried the NWA Championship across 8 reigns and defined what a traveling world champion looked like in the modern era. His ability to draw money, work a crowd, and deliver classic matches night after night is beyond question. But Flair needed 8 reigns to accumulate a combined total that Thesz nearly matched in a single run, and Flair never possessed the legitimate grappling credentials that made Thesz uniquely qualified for the role. Hulk Hogan transformed professional wrestling into a global entertainment phenomenon and arguably did more for the business's mainstream visibility than any other performer in history. But Hogan's contributions were cultural, not athletic. He was a character, a phenomenon, a marketing juggernaut, and by Thesz's standards, and frankly by the standards of most serious wrestling analysts, he was never close to the best in-ring competitor of any era he worked in. El Santo transcended wrestling entirely in Mexico, becoming a folk hero and cinema icon. Andre the Giant was a physical marvel who drew money on spectacle alone, but neither man could match Thesz's sustained championship-level excellence across multiple decades, multiple continents, and multiple eras of the business. The strongest case against Thesz belongs to the era argument. Wrestling was different then. The business was more regional, the talent pool arguably thinner. The athletic demands less extreme than what modern performers endure. That is a fair point, and it deserves an honest answer. Yes, the business was different, but Thesz was not competing against modern performers. He was competing against the best of his era, and he dominated them so thoroughly and for so long that his peers, men who had every reason to resent him, acknowledged his supremacy. Ed Lewis, a 6-time world champion himself, called Thesz the finest wrestler he had ever seen. The NWA, a coalition of hard-nosed promoters who agreed on almost nothing, agreed unanimously that Thesz was the man to carry their championship for the better part of 2 decades. That is not a fluke. That is a consensus built on undeniable excellence. When you combine the championship longevity, the legitimate wrestling credentials, the technical innovations, the global impact, the 7-decade career span, and the absolute trust that an entire industry placed in one man, the verdict becomes difficult to contest. Others were bigger stars. Others drew more money. Others had more cultural impact. But nobody was a more complete, more legitimate, more enduring world champion than Thesz. If professional wrestling has a Mount Rushmore, his face goes on it first. From a shoe repair shop in St. Louis to the main event in Tokyo, from the Great Depression to the dawn of the Internet age, Thesz carried professional wrestling on his back for longer than most careers last in any field. He was the real thing in a business that was learning how to be fake, and he never apologized for it. The last hooker, the undisputed champion, the standard against which all others are measured and found wanting. If you want to understand the rivalry that accidentally created the WWE, check out our video on Buddy Rogers, the man whose feud with Thesz split the wrestling world in 2 and changed everything that came after.